Thank you. Thank you very much. Wow, such a huge group. I kind of wish Charlie hadn't mentioned that thing about Sunday morning television, since I'm wearing the same suit I had on this morning. I did not have time to change from New York. I took the tie off, but this is the same. If your color didn't look right in your television set, it is the same one. You have a beautiful campus here. I got here a little early, so I took a walk around. So some of you stared at me kind of funny, and yes, that was me walking around your campus. I wasn't stalking anybody, or I had my hands in my pockets. I realized, I was the only person by myself on this entire campus. So I wasn't trying to cause any trouble, I promise. Well, I always enjoy coming out and speaking at universities, particularly since I have learned so much in my life from teachers. I'm going to share some of that with you. There will be no moment in this talk, however, where I pull out my reading glasses and reach into my inside pocket of the suit that I already wore on television and pull out a speech and unfold it and read it to you. I speak without printed notes. There's a reason for this, actually, that goes back, well, actually, there's a couple reasons. It goes back to the first time I ever went out and spoke publicly, which was pretty much a disaster and scarred me for the rest of my life. I was a young sports writer in the South Florida area, and I had never been asked to speak before to anybody, and I got asked to speak to a lodge. It was an elks or a moose, or it was a big animal of some kind, I remember that. And having never been asked to speak before publicly, I did what probably many of you would have done. I typed up a whole speech. And I arrived to this lodge for this breakfast meeting. It was a Saturday morning. And as you know, South Florida has a pretty good elderly population. And I walked into this big animal lodge and was the youngest person there by about 97 years. And I proceeded to do what they tell you to never do in Speaking 101. I read my speech with my head down the entire time. And when I looked up at the end, no, they hadn't all left. But they might as well have, let's put it that way. Just a sea of blank expressions. And so I said, well, that's it. Are there any questions? Nothing. Are there any comments? Nothing. So I sat down to this polite, that kind of thing. And they're taking the plates away, and I'm feeling like a complete failure, and this one older gentleman comes up to me. He says, "Can I ask you a question?" So, I'm just happy to have anybody talking to me. I said, "Sure, what?" He said, "You gonna eat that Danish?" So that was lesson number one in no prepared speeches. Lesson number two actually comes from the sports writing part of my life, which I don't do as much as I used to. But in the sports writing world, we're expected to be very glib, very quick on our feet, always have a witty repartee for whatever comes up. And in fact, there's a story that goes around our business that illustrates this, which may or may not be true. We like to think that it's true. About a sports writer back in the 60s, back when we used to actually travel on the same planes or trains as the teams that we covered. And in this particular incident, the sports writer was on the airplane with a football team, and he wound up on the inside seat next to a football player named Bubba. Now, I could tell you Bubba's last name, but what's the point? Most Bubbas, when it comes to football, are pretty much the same. 6'6", 350 pounds. The game had been lost, so the sports writer knew not to bother Bubba with a lot of small talk. The flight attendants bought the meals, they ate, they took the trays away, and pretty soon Bubba, exhausted, fell asleep. And not long after that, the sports writer began to feel a little queasy, sick in his stomach. So now he had a very important decision to make. Should he wake up Bubba, 6'6", 350 pounds, so they could get out in the aisle and go down to the lavatory, or should he just tough it out? And because he was an intelligent fellow, he was a sports writer, he decided he would just tough it out. And he sat there for about 30 seconds, and then he realized he had made the wrong decision. And option A was no longer on the table. And so he lunged forward to get the air sickness bag. And as he reached to get the air sickness bag, he got sick all over Bubba's lap. So now Bubba, 6'6", 350 pounds, kind of blinks, stirs, wakes up, looks down, sees this mess in his lap, and the sports writer, without missing a beat, says, "Feeling better, Bubba?" So now, I ask you, am I going to dishonor a tradition like that with a prepared speech? But the real reason I don't need to reach into my pocket at any point here tonight is because the stories that I want to share with you are forever embedded in my head and in my heart. It would be shame on me if I needed to look at a piece of paper to recall them. They really hearken to two older men who were teachers in my life, although they were quite dissimilar. One of them actually worked as a teacher. That was his job. His name was Morrie Schwartz. He was the Morrie of the book Tuesdays with Morrie. Morrie was a college professor at Brandeis University. Stood about, yay high. He had silver hair, green eyes, kind of crooked tooth smile, and a really wonderful way of making you feel like you were the only student he'd ever taught, which I think is the mark of a lot of great teachers. I met him, I'll never forget, first day of classes, 1975, Brandeis University. I walked into his classroom. He taught sociology. It was one of those intro courses. And I entered the room, and there were 9 people in the class. And being a typical freshman, I immediately sized up the situation and said, no. This is much too small a class. If I cut it, they'll know I'm not here. I wanted a class about this size, you know. And so I was actually leaving the room to go drop the class at the registrar's office when he began to call roll from the pre-assigned people. And one of the problems when your last name begins with A. And so I heard him say Mitch Albom, and so I kind of slid back in out of guilt, and I said, here. And he said, is it Mitch or Mitchell? Which do you prefer? Now, I'm sure that doesn't mean anything to you, but to me, I was actually grateful that he asked, because I have one of those names, depending on what the teacher wants to call you. It changes from year to year, Mitch, Mitchell, Mitchie, whatever it is. And so I said, well, Mitch is what my friends call me, Mitch. And he said, all right, Mitch it is. And Mitch? I said, yeah. He said, I hope one day you'll think of me as your friend. So I knew cutting the class was out of the question at that point. But that began this really remarkable relationship that Morrie and I had that ended up spanning all 4 years that I was in college. I not only took that class, but I took the next class with him, the next class with him. I wound up taking every class that Morrie offered. I wound up majoring in sociology, not because I was really all that interested in it, but it would have been a shame to waste all those credits. I actually really majored in Morrie, but they weren't giving out degrees in that at the time. In fact, by my senior year, we had run out of classes to take together, and because I wanted to continue to study with them, we invented a class. You could do that kind of thing back in the 70s. And in fact, those of you who are in education here may get a kick. Such was the state of a liberal arts education in the Northeast at Brandeis University in the late 70s in the field of sociology that I was able to write and get credit for an honors thesis whose title was, and I'm not making this up, Football, Its Role in Society, which is still the seminal work on that topic, I want you to know. And maybe the only one. But I didn't care because it enabled me to continue to visit with Morrie. We really, by that point, had become more of like an uncle, than a teacher. We hung around campus together. We walked around. We sat under trees outside. We would eat meals together sometimes. It delighted me to find out that Morrie, in his own way, was as much of a slob when it came to eating as I was, not because he lacked manners, but because he was always full of these huge ideas, like those professors always go, follow your dreams and get involved with your community and follow your heart. Don't worry about what the pre-med students are doing, or don't be like the pre-law students worrying about your grades or your money all your time. Just follow your dreams and do the things you dream about doing, all these great, big, huge, wonderful ideas, but sometimes he would forget to chew. And I can still see him. He used to eat these egg salad sandwiches. And you'd be sitting across from him, and these little yellow projectiles would come, and you'd be like a hockey goalie, But I didn't care. It was just another sort of endearing quality that brought us closer together. And Come graduation day, I bought him a present. I'd never gotten a teacher a present before in my life. I got him a briefcase. I didn't have a dime to my name back then, so it must have been the world's cheapest briefcase. But I did manage to get his initials kind of, put on there, or rubbed on or whatever. And I gave it to him, and you would have thought I was giving him a brick of gold. I mean, he turned it every which way over and everything, and he began to cry a little bit, which wasn't that unusual for Morrie. And he took me around, he hugged me, and he said, "Mitch, you're one of the good ones. Promise me you'll stay in touch." I said, "Okay, I will." I said, "Promise." "Okay, I promise." "Say it in a sentence." Like every teacher I've ever had. "Okay, Morrie, I promise to stay in touch. I promise to stay in touch." And then I graduated. Went off into the world to do all those nice things that you heard in the introduction. And I proceeded to break that promise every day, every week, every month, and every year for 16 years. 16 years without a word. Now I can hear what you're all too polite to say. How do you do that? Just got done telling us how close you were with them, right? Well, trust me, there are people in this room who know what I'm saying is true. It's not as if we intend to lose touch with our teachers. When you get out of college, you always figure you're going to drive back that next summer and visit. And I'll come back the next summer, I'll visit. And then a couple of years pass, you say, well, I'll call first, and then I'll drive up and I'll visit. And a few more years pass, you say, well, I'll write a letter, and then maybe I'll call, and then maybe I'll go to visit. And meanwhile, if you're like me, or like a lot of young people in this country, your career starts taking you, off the runway like a jet. And in my case, when I got into the media, it happened pretty quickly. I was working for a newspaper, then started doing a little radio work, I started traveling around, then I did a television appearance, and I'm hanging around with Michael Jordan or Barry Sanders, and you get a bigger paycheck and an award and another bigger paycheck and a bigger house, another bigger paycheck, you're on television, someone asks for your autograph, another bigger paycheck, another award, and one day you wake up and you say, this was meant to be. I was hatched out of the egg with all the success coming my way. We forget the people who make us the kind of people who can have that kind of success. We forget our teachers. And I forgot mine for 16 years. Well, during that time, Morrie continued to do what he'd always done. He taught small groups of kids. He wasn't aspiring to be the dean of the university. He didn't want to go to Harvard to prove how smart he was, whatever. He was happy reaching a handful of students every year. And when he wasn't teaching, he was doing the things he told me to do. He was involved with his community. He started clinics in the Boston area. And when he wasn't doing that, he never sat at home and watched television. He wasn't that kind of guy. He was always looking for new experiences, new things in life. He used to go dancing on Wednesday nights by himself at this place called Dance Free in Harvard Square. You could pay $5. You went into a converted church, and you could dance any way you wanted with anybody you wanted. And he would show up there with a towel around his neck and these sweatpants on, and he would go in and do the rumba and the tango and the merengue. They were playing rock and roll music at the time, unfortunately. That didn't seem to bother him. He did whatever he wanted to do. He would grab one co-ed or another one and spin around. He'd be all sweaty by the end of the night. Nobody even knew who he was, that he was this professor. There was this kooky old white-haired guy. And he didn't care, because that's how Morrie was. He just loved living life, To him, life was like a wet rag you got. You could squeeze all this joy out of it every day, and then you wake up the next day, you get a whole new rag to work with, and all you had to do was just squeeze it, and it was full of all this wondrous stuff. And he went on like that through his 50s, through his 60s, into his 70s, quite content, living a very happy life. At one point, he had a birthday party when he was 70. He said, "I'm going to live to be 100. Then in his mid-70s, began to notice a change in his body. It was subtle at first. Long walks would leave him tired. He'd say, I'm getting old. Going up steps, he'd have to stop and rest. Then he began to stumble inexplicably, get out of the car, and he would just trip, fall over the curb. One time he was out on a dance floor, and he just fell for no reason. And as he would later say to me, Mitch, I never fell when I danced. So he began that process that we have in this country, trying to find out what's wrong with him. And he went to one doctor and another specialist, and one CAT scan and one MRI and one blood test and one this and that. 8 months worth of going back and forth to doctors and specialists and trying to find out why his body was betraying him. Until finally, on a beautiful summer day, much like the day we had here today, he sat in a Boston neurologist's office, and the doctor said to him, Morrie, I got some bad news. You have ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. Morrie thought back to his youth. He'd grown up in New York. He remembered the Lou Gehrig story. He said, Lou Gehrig's disease? That's fatal. The doctor said, yeah. Morrie said, well, it used to be fatal, right? I mean, they have a cure for it now, right? No, the doctor said, there's no cure. Well, how long do I have left to live? Morrie asked. Hard to say, the doctor said. Maybe a couple years. Well, Morrie left that doctor's office, walked outside to the same beautiful summer day he left behind just a couple hours earlier. And he took in the view. He saw the blue skies, he saw kids playing frisbee, he saw people laughing, shopping, enjoying themselves, and a voice inside of him screamed, hey! Hey! What's going on? Don't you all know what just happened to me in there? Isn't everybody supposed to come running up to me now and say, we heard the news. It's so sad. No more frisbee, no more blue skies, no more laughter. The whole world will turn gray because you got a death sentence. We'll all go through it together with you. And he waited for that to happen. But it didn't happen. Because the world cannot cater to one individual. And so on the steps of that building, my old professor made a very profound decision. He could either go this way, be angry, bitter, all the rest of his days, why me? Or he'd go this way, try to find something positive in this terribly negative hand that he had been dealt. And because he'd always been more positive than negative, and because he'd always been a teacher, he chose. And he decided he would teach about what it was like to die, right up until the day he died. After all, he figured everybody's going to die. There must be something that I can learn that I can pass on. That's what I do. That's what a teacher does. And so even as ALS began its terrible march through Morrie's body, and if any of you have had any exposure to this disease, then you know it is just one of the cruelest inventions, because it snips the connection between your brain and your muscles and your nerves, so that slowly your body atrophies, it stiffens, it ultimately becomes a useless husk that just needs to be carried from place to place. And yet your mind stays perfectly intact throughout the whole process. So you're fully aware of the horror that's happening to you right up until the day you die. And in Morrie's case, it began with his legs and worked up his body. And even as he lost the ability to walk without a cane, and then a cane to a walker, and then a walker to a wheelchair, and then a wheelchair to somebody carrying him from place to place. Even as he lost the ability to pull up his own pants or to buckle his own belt, to brush his hair, to brush his teeth, even as he lost the ability to take a shower by himself, even as he lost the ability to wipe his own rear end and needed to ask someone to do it for him like an infant. Through all that, he taught. He invited people in. Come ask me questions, he said. I don't mind. I'm not embarrassed. Pay no attention to this decaying body. That's not me. That's the carton I was shipped in. It's not me. I'm still here. Look in my eyes. I'm still here. You want to do me a favor? Don't treat me like I'm already dead. He taught. He learned things. He went to a funeral in a wheelchair of a friend of his, and he came back and he said to his wife, you know, what a shame that was. Poor Irv. He never got to hear any of those nice things that all those people had to say about him. And Morrie thought about it. He said, that's not for me. If someone's got something nice to say about me, I want to hear it right now. 2 weeks later, he invited 25 of his closest friends and family to his house for a living funeral. Each member stood up and said something about the deceased, a poem, a joke, or whatever. But at the end, the deceased was able to stand up and thank everybody for coming to the funeral. He taught, he learned, he wrote down these aphorisms that he had about living with a terminal illness, and pretty soon he had a pretty good list of them. And unbeknownst to him, a friend of his sent them off to a reporter at the Boston Globe. That reporter wrote a story about the strange old man who was teaching his last class and dying. That story found its way down to the desk of Ted Koppel on Nightline. And next thing you know, Nightline is coming up and doing a segment about my old professor, Morrie Schwartz. And when that segment aired on a Friday night, 1,000 miles away, in my very comfortable house, in my very comfortable suburb, on my very large TV screen, I was doing the great American male tradition. When I came upon the Nightline program and did a double take, because there on the screen was a white-haired, thin, sickly-looking version, but very much my old professor talking about what it was like to die. And it was only through that chance flipping of the remote control that I found out that this man who had meant so much to me 16 years earlier now only had a few months left to live. Well, what do you do when that happens? You're embarrassed. You're horrified. I vowed that I would call him up once. So all it was going to be, one phone call, ease my conscience. I dialed information. His number was still listed. Nurse answered the phone. When I was back in college, I used to call Morrie Coach. I don't know, it was a sports affectation, I guess even. I coach, how's it going, Coach, that kind of thing. And so when his nurse answered the phone, she handed it to him. He said hello. I said, hello, Professor Schwartz, this is Mitch Albom. I was a student of yours back in the 70s. I don't know if you remember me. And the first thing my old professor said to me after 16 years, how come you didn't call me Coach? Needless to say, by the end of the conversation, I was coming to visit him. Guilt is a very powerful emotion. Still, it was only supposed to be a one-time visit. That's all. One-time visit, say hello, ease my conscience, get out. I landed at the Boston airport. At that point in my life, you'd think that introduction sounds busy. You should have seen me back then. I worked 90 to 100 hours a week. I never said no to anything that was offered to me. Freelance work, television work, radio work, newspaper work, magazine work, whatever it was. I was one of those people that was afraid if I said no, they wouldn't ask again. And so I just kept piling it on. And when I landed at the Boston airport, I was in between so many jobs that I rented a cell phone, which wasn't that common at the time, and drove into Morrie's neighborhood, talking all the time on the phone to ESPN. And unbeknownst to me, Morrie had asked his nurses to carry him outside in his wheelchair so that he could greet me right at the curb. It was a warm day. And I come driving down the street, and up ahead I see this figure in a wheelchair flanked by two nurses. And I kind of figure out what's going on, and I hit the brakes. Now, the proper thing to do, of course, is to take the cell phone, toss it out the window, and run out and give a hug to this man who I haven't seen in 16 years, right? And I'd like to say that that's what I did. But I didn't. What I did do was continue the conversation on the cell phone, but slowly drop down below the dashboard, pretending like I was looking for something on the floor, my keys or something. And I stayed on the floor of that car for 3 or 4 minutes, lying on my back, talking to ESPN about something I can't even remember now. Because at that point in my life, work came first and everything else could wait, even a dying old man. That's a pretty embarrassing story to tell about yourself. I do so because no matter where I go, whenever I talk about Morrie, I know there's at least one person in the crowd who, if they were in the same situation as me, would be on that cell phone too. Learn from my mistake. It was a mistake. People before cell phones. Usually at this time somebody's cell phone goes off, so we can just wait. Anyhow, Morrie forgave me that little sin. I don't think he knew what a cell phone was. When I got out of the car, we went into his house. He wanted to eat. I, of course, had visions of egg salad, but we sat at the table, and I watched him try to cut a little piece of tomato and bring it up to his mouth, and it fell off his fork, and he tried again, his hands shaking, and it fell off again, and he tried again, his hands shaking. 5 minutes to try to get a single piece of tomato into his mouth. The house was a sick person's house, if you know what I mean. You know, it had bottles of pills on the counter. It had a certain smell to it. There were bedpans and oxygen machines. There were hospice people moving around. And yet, Morrie never complained about anything. All he talked about was all these wonderful things that were happening and things he was learning. And even as he couldn't move, even as he said, I have to go to the commode, and someone literally carried him to the toilet and then carried him back. And I ended up staying all afternoon and into the evening, and finally when I flew home on the last plane home, I said to myself, you know, you're 37 years old and you're perfectly healthy. And he's 78 years old and dying. And yet he seems 10 times happier than you are. What's the matter with this picture? And I began to go back. The next Tuesday, 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 and all the Tuesdays that Morrie had left to try to get the answer to that question. What do we know when we're really looking death in the face that puts everything into perspective? And wouldn't it be great to know that now, when we're young enough and healthy enough to do something about it? And each week that I visited with Morrie, we were able to sort of take one subject at a time, and Morrie would say, well, that matters. No, that doesn't really matter. You think this matters, but when you get to where I am, it's not going to matter. And I want to share some of those with you, particularly the students here who, if they were like me when I was a student, you already think you know everything. And some of the teachers and older people here as well. For example, some of the things that we talked about. Aging. All right, I can see just from what I can see here, there's all ages represented in this room. Well, let's face it. In America, you can't be two things enough. Young enough, thin enough. Right? You cannot be too young and you cannot be too thin. Not anymore in this country. In fact, in America, we basically have a system that after you get to a certain age, you start doing things to deny your age or to try to get younger again, whether you realize it or not. Think about it, guys. After you turn 30, you start working out. We used to call it playing sports. Now it's working out. It has a whole new sense of purpose to it. Or women, if you go shopping for your family, you start pulling the boxes out and you read that little black and white box with the carbohydrates and the saturated fats and all. You didn't used to eat like that, but now you have to look at those things. Or guys, you get a little bit older, you start losing your hair, you start flopping it over onto the other side, you know. Or you're getting into your 40s, you're getting your tummies tucked, or your liposucked, your face lifted, and then you get into your 50s, you're dumping your first wife or your first husband, and next thing you know, you're driving around in a little red sports car with the top down listening to rap music and saying, oh, I've been listening to it for years. I think it's fabulous. All in this effort to stay young. We're going to be the first generation that doesn't age and doesn't die. Everybody before us, they got old and sick and died, but I don't know what it is, but we're not going to get any older. And so we keep doing all these things. We envy the young, their youth, and we don't want to believe that we're not part of them. My good friend Dave Barry says that they invented oldies radio so that people our age would think that our music was still actually being played on the radio, you know? Oh, look, Chubby Checker, it's still #1. We envy the young, their youth. We don't want to get older. We worry about getting older all the time. Kids in college even worry about, well, I'm 21 and I don't know what I want to do with myself. And it occurred to me that here I was, this relatively younger person, visiting this older, dying man. And so one morning I went into Morrie and I said, let me ask you something. How do you keep from envying me, my youth? How do you keep from saying, how come he gets to walk? I can't walk anymore. How come he gets to go home, fly in a plane, and I'm going to die in this house? How come he gets to be young, and I'm old? Morrie thought about it. And he said, Mitch, I don't look at aging that way. To me, age is not a competition. Inside me is every age I've ever been. 10-year-old, 20-year-old, 37 like you, but also 50, 60, 78-year-old man. When it's time for me to behave silly with a child, tell a chicken cross the road joke or laugh, I can do that. It's inside me somewhere. When it's time for me to listen to a college student who thinks the world is going to end because her boyfriend broke up with her, I remember those days too. I can relate. But when it's time for me to be a 78-year-old man with all the wit and wisdom of my 78 years here on earth, then I can do that too. So why should I be envious of where you are? I've already been where you are. You should be envious of me. I got 40 years on you. He was right. Morrie looked at aging as sort of like gaining interest on your principal, you know. Every day you get up, there's a little bit more there, you know. And I thought, this is such a better way to go through life than dreading your 21st birthday, your 29th birthday, your 39th, your 49th, your 59th. So I ended up putting that in that book in a little chapter on aging. Money. There's not a person here, not the people who are already out in the working world, not the students who are thinking about it. There's not a person here to whom money is not an issue. It's funny, when I was visiting Morrie, Ted Turner was in the news a lot. Do you know Ted Turner? He owns CNN and a bunch of other stuff. He used to own Jane Fonda. Traded that in. But at the time, he was trying to buy CBS. And it was in all the newspapers. And I was in a paper I was reading as I was flying in to see Morrie. And it was very important that he buy CBS. He was leveraging stock. He was doing everything he could to buy CBS. And in this newspaper article, a reporter actually said to him, Mr. Turner, you already own so much. You're so rich. Why is it so important to you that you buy CBS? And his answer in this newspaper story was, I don't want my tombstone to read, he never owned a network. So I brought that to Morrie, who at the time was actually trying to decide what his tombstone should read. And I said, how about this? You never owned a network either. He passed on the idea, but it brings to mind something that's very important. You know, I wasn't the only person to visit Morrie during that stretch. People came on other days, and once in a while someone else would come on a Tuesday. And there were a lot of people who just came to see Morrie one time. After seeing him on television, they had some vague connection, and they would see him once, and they were never coming back. And they always followed a similar pattern. They were always very uncomfortable with seeing someone who was sick or who was dying. And they would stand outside in the hallway or whatever while he was getting ready, and they would psych themselves up. You know, okay, I'm going to tell happy stories. I'm going to show them pictures of my kids. Nothing sad. I'm not going to talk about anything sad, nothing sad. And then they would go into the office, and the door would close. And they would come out an hour later in tears. But they'd be crying about their divorce, their job, their love life. And they would say, I don't know what happened. I went in and, you know, I tried to sort of cheer him up and everything, but next thing I know, he's asking me questions about my life, and then I'm telling him things, and he's asking me more, and I'm telling him more, and next thing I know, I'm crying, and he's comforting me. I went in to comfort him, but he ended up comforting me. And folks, I watched this happen so many times that finally I walked into Morrie and said, I don't get it. If ever anyone had finally earned the right to say the sentence, let's not talk about your problems. Let's talk about my problems. Be you. If ever anyone had finally earned the right to say, you think you got it bad. I said, you've hit the mother lode of sympathy here. Why don't you take advantage of it? And he looked at me as if I had just stepped off a spaceship. And he said, Mitch, that's taking. Why would I want to take from people like that? Taking just makes me feel more like I'm dying. Giving makes me feel like I'm living. Giving makes me feel like I'm living. It is a profound little sentence. It also rhymes, so it's easy to remember. Giving makes me feel like I'm living. And you know that it's true because you know in your heart the opposite is false. Taking never makes you feel alive. It doesn't. Oh, we would like to think it is. It's the basis of Madison Avenue. It's the basis of consumerism. You know, all the ads and everything. You take this product, you feel alive. Take this deodorant soap, put it under your arm. Now I'm alive. Take this washer and dryer. Now my life is good. Take this vacation. Wow, I've never been so happy. But it doesn't work that way. Taking things, we're all like kids on Christmas morning. You ever see a 10-year-old on Christmas morning? You put a box in front of them. Wow, this is great. What else you got? Always on to the next thing. Taking will never make you feel alive. I'll give you an example. Everybody here, most everybody here, looks like they're of driving age. Okay. In your mind, follow the progression of cars in your life, okay? When you get your first car, what's the one and only thing you care about? Please, God, let it run, right? You're not worried about the model, the make, the year. You just want it to start. It's like, please, please, please. Just let it run so I can go to the mall or I can go pick up my girlfriend or whatever it is, right? Then a few years later, you say, boy, if I could just have a car that didn't break down every 2 months, I'd never want anything else. You save your money, you get one of those. A few years later, you say, boy, if I could just have a new car once just to smell the smell and to see the sticker on the window. I could never want anything more than that. So you get a new car, and then you say, you have a few kids, you say, boy, if I just had a 4-door, make it a little bit easier. Oh, who could want more than that? So you end up getting a 4-door. Then a few years later, you say, I know it's crazy, I know it's wild, I know it's nuts, but my whole life, I've always wanted a convertible. If I had a convertible, I could never want anything else. And you save and you save and save. You finally buy yourself a convertible, and you're driving down the street with the top down, and you go, boy, those SUVs look pretty nice. Right? Poor man want to be rich. Rich man want to be king. King isn't satisfied till he rules everything. That's not me, that's Bruce Springsteen. But it's a good line. The taking never makes you feel alive. Think of all the movies that you've seen in your life where they have those scenes where the old man is dying and the family gathers around to hear what his last words are going to be. You know, ooh, what's he going to say? What's he going to say? Does he ever, in any movie you can think of, with his dying breath, ever utter a sentence like, bring me the big screen television set. I just want to touch it one more time. No. You laugh because it's preposterous. And yet, think about that moment when you are clinging to life with your fingertips, that last dying moment. If in that moment, all that you own is of no use to you. It's probably not even in the same room as you. It's in the garage, it's in the summer house, it's in the bank vault. If in that moment, that last drop of sand through the hourglass, all that matters is that the people you love are there with you, and you can look them in the eye and hold their hand, tell them you love them, then what makes you think that in all the other drops of sand through the hourglass, that isn't what matters too? What do they teach us in high school about grains of sand? You know, you can't tell one from the other, indistinguishable. The one that's dropping now, as you're listening to me, and the things that are important, is the same as the one that's going to drop on your dying day. And what's going to be important in that last drop of sand is what's important in the one that's dropping now. We just don't believe it because we all think we got endless sand. To me, there was one overriding lesson from September 11th, and it had nothing to do with global terrorism or all the rest of that stuff. It was very human and very simple. The people who were caught in those burning buildings or on those planes who managed to get a hold of cell phones, telephones, and make a phone call, it was an astounding human study. To a person, whether they were rich or poor, male or female, old or young, black or white, American or foreign, to a person, their messages were the same. They called their family, their loved ones, and they said, I called to tell you I love you. Not, get me out of here. Not, honey, sell the stock. I called to tell you I love you. Not even, I called to hear you say you love me. In that final terrible moment where they really realized that death was just a few seconds away, what made them feel alive was giving out their love to somebody else. I called to tell you I love you. Giving is the essence of living. And anyone who's ever done volunteer work or hospice work or anything like that, and at the end of the day you're cleaning up, and someone calls your name out and you say, yeah, and they say, thank you, thanks for helping, and you get like a little, I don't know, tingle in your stomach, that's being alive. And it doesn't take owning a network, and we shouldn't have to wait till our dying day to figure it out. Two more brief things I want to share with you, and then I'll wrap up. One happened with Morrie very unexpectedly. One of my later visits, I noticed that there was a bust of Morrie as a younger man, sculpted and sitting on one of his shelves. And it was kind of weird. I don't really know anybody who's had a bust sculpted of them, except Beethoven. I didn't actually know him personally. And so I said to Morrie, who did that? And he said, oh, well, there's kind of a sad story with that. That was my friend Norman. And I said, Norman, I've been coming here for months. I never even heard you mention the name. He said, well, That's because of the sad story. And he proceeded to tell me this tale of his good friend Norman. They were real buddies. They traveled around together. They swam together. Norman fancied himself a bit of an amateur sculptor, so one summer Morrie went over his house every morning and they worked on this bust. And at the end of the summer, he gave it to Morrie as a gift of their friendship. Well, not long after that, Norman and his wife moved away to Chicago. And not long after that, Morrie's wife took ill back in Boston. And Norman and his wife didn't call right away to see how she was. And Morrie took offense. They're our friends, they should call. And so when Norman finally did call, Morrie was stubborn, obstinate. Oh, now you call. I'm sorry, Morrie, Norman said. I should have called her. No, it's a little late for that. And every subsequent phone call over the weeks and months always had that overtone of that issue. Gee, Morrie, Norman said, I still feel bad about the thing. No, don't bring it up anymore. But I still feel bad. No, it's over. Forget it. It's over. It's over. It wasn't over. Crack had developed in the friendship. And because that crack was never attended to, it spread. And it crumbled the relationship. And they lost touch. Now, folks, I'm here to tell you that Morrie didn't need reasons to cry. I mean, when you need someone to carry you to the bathroom, when you need someone to reach down your throat with a tissue and try to pull the phlegm out of your windpipe because you lack the ability to cough it up, you could choke to death on it. I don't think you really need a reason to cry. You can pretty much pick any minute of the day. And yet, I never saw Morrie cry as deeply or as passionately as he did when he finished that story about Norman. Tears that came, not from the eyes, but from the solar plexus, like that. And he said, Mitch, I found out last year that Norman died from cancer. I never had the chance to make it up to him. Why did I let that foolish little argument separate us for all these years? It means nothing to me now. Nothing. All I wish is that I could hold his hand one more time, look him in the eye, tell him what a good friend he'd been all those years. But I can't. And I never will. And he looked me in the eye and he said, Mitch, if there's anyone you love, anyone you care about, who you're fighting with or you're feuding with, let it go. Let it go. If you are 100% right and they're 100% wrong, you say you're wrong, if that'll end it. Because when you get to where I am, and you will, you won't care who was right or wrong. You'll only care that they're there, and you can hold their hand and you can look them in the eye. Tell them you love them. Forgive everyone. Everything. Everything. Not most things. Not all but the big thing. Everything. And that is not a lesson we should wait till our dying day to learn. Believe me. And so I put that in the book in a little chapter on forgiveness. Here's the last thing that I want to share that I went through with Morrie. It was actually on the last visit that I had with him, and by this point it was pretty tough to hear Morrie speak. You had to lean in real close. And he said to me, I want to ask you a favor. I said, sure, anything. He said, after I'm dead, I want you to come visit me in my grave. All right, I said, I was going to do that anyhow. He said, well, not the way everybody else comes. Drive in, put down some flowers, drive away. I want you to come when you have some time. Bring a blanket. Bring some sandwiches. Plan on sticking around for a little while. And I want you to talk to me about your life, about your problems. Just tell me what's going on. And I said, wait a minute. You want me to come to the cemetery, have a picnic at your tombstone, and talk to the air? Exactly, he said. Just like we're talking now. I love it so much. I said, well, Morrie, let's face it, it's not going to be like we're talking now because you're not going to be able to talk back. And he looked at me as if I were being very naive, and he said, well, Mitch, I'll make you a deal. After I'm dead, you talk. I'll listen. Well, I laughed too. But when Morrie finally died, a few days after that, and I sat in the basement of my house trying to write this book to pay his medical expenses, which was the only reason that book was ever written, is where all the money went. And it wasn't supposed to be a big book. It was supposed to be about as big as this. I tried to figure out what I was trying to say, and I kept coming back to that little sentence, you talk, I'll listen. And I realized that wasn't an accident, that was one of the last things that Morrie said to me. That in that sentence is everything that he was trying to teach me ever since I was a 17-year-old kid. And everything that I'm trying to get across to you here tonight. And that's simply this. If you lead your life, as Morrie did, with people, making time for people, giving of yourself to people, making memories with people, then when you're dead, you're not 100% dead. You live on inside the heads and the hearts of everyone you've touched. And they can talk to you after you're gone. Not because they believe in ghosts or seances, but because you spent time while you were here putting your voice inside them so they can still hear it. It rings around. It's like a penny in a piggy bank. When you put a penny in the piggy bank, you can't see it anymore, right? It's gone as far as you know. If you take the bank, shake. You hear it. You know it's there. How many times you've been at a Christmas dinner after somebody's passed away or Thanksgiving, whatever, and someone says, oh, if Mom were still alive, if she saw that chicken, she'd tell you didn't cook it. You know. If Uncle Charlie were here and you tried to give him those sweet potatoes, he'd tell you, I don't eat sweet potatoes. You know. Well, why do you think you know those things? Because they spent time making those memories with you, and you repeat them after you're gone. This is how you live on. The 5 people you meet in heaven, the book that I wrote, the book that's out now, is based on an old uncle of mine. A guy who thought he didn't matter, my grandmother's brother, who used to tell me his stories at the Thanksgiving table. And in that book, he dies and he goes to heaven and finds out that this blue-collar, nothing life that he thought he led, reaching nobody, touching nobody, actually, by meeting 5 different people who were in his life, just even for a minute, he realized he had all this impact because one life touches another, touches another, touches another. As Morrie said, death ends a life, but not a relationship. The relationships go on. But, and here's the big but of this whole talk. So if you've been sleeping until now, this is when you want to wake up. And you'll still get the gist of it. And you can tell your friends, oh, I heard the whole thing. But you must invest in those relationships while you're here if you expect them to go on. So, if you spend all day working, as I've spent far too many of my days already, if you spend all day in front of the makeup mirror trying to get gorgeous, or at the gym trying to get buff, if you spend all day working on your portfolio, or all day trying to do all these amazing achievements so that you can get on the cover of some magazine as Forbes 500, this or that or the other thing, then when you die, you better plan on being 100% dead. Dead, with a capital D. Because your money, they'll just fight over after you're gone. They always do. Your beautiful body, no matter how buff, is going to rot in the ground right next to the fat guy. Your list of accomplishments, no matter how impressive, will pale in comparison to the next hotshot who comes along. But that one thing that you all have that makes you distinctly you, that separates you from the person you're sitting next to, from the person in the row behind you, from everybody in this room, everybody in this state, everybody in this country, and everybody on this planet. That voice that is the sum of everything that you've seen and you've done and you've felt and you've experienced and you've loved and you've learned, that voice that makes you you, you didn't spend any time giving away. You were too busy taking to feel alive. So if you really want to go on, You really want to cheat death, put your chips on immortality a little bit? It is not in owning a network. It is not in having a huge stock portfolio. It's in every act of kindness and sharing and memory making and laughing that you have with other human beings. That is how you live on. And if you don't think that that's true, or if you think that's just a corny way for your speaker to wrap up his speech, then look around. Why are you here? Why are you standing out there? Why are you sitting up there? Why are you in some room I can't even see? You don't know me. You didn't know Morrie. You didn't know my Uncle Eddie. They weren't rich. They weren't famous. They were just nice old people who took time to make some memories with me. I put them down in a book. Somebody gave that book to somebody, who gave that book to somebody, who shared it with somebody, who shared it with somebody else. And now look how large their classroom has grown for men who aren't even here to teach. Neither one of them had any idea that a book would be read about them one day. And yet it is. And they live on. And they touch people in endless ways. There's a picture in the back of the 5 people you meet in heaven of my uncle with no caption underneath it. And 10 million people have now seen him and are looking at this guy, and I'm just hoping that there are books up in heaven so he gets to walk around and say, "That's me in the back of the book." One life touches another, touches another. So, on behalf of my old professor and my old uncle, both of whom would have loved to have been here tonight, particularly Morrie on a college campus, and for all the teachers who are here tonight, let me just add, you are the most underappreciated and underpaid segment of our society, bar none. Why you do what you do for the rewards you get, the tangible ones, is beyond me, and it must be because of the intangible ones. Please know that amongst your students here, you may not believe it, but they do care about you. You are making a difference. And they may not come back next year, and they may not come back in 2 years, and they may not come back until 16 years later. But they come back. In some way, shape, or form, they come back because you affected them. You are inside them. You are the penny inside that piggy bank. And they can still hear you when they shake it up, even if they're not in your presence. And to all the students who are here, I hope while you're here at college, the high school kids who I understand are here who are trying to decide in a college, find yourself a teacher. Find yourself a mentor. One who you can make that connection with. And you will be enriched beyond your wildest dreams, beyond any career that you think you're going to have down the pike. Because you'll have somebody to call over the years and say, "What do you think? How you been? Look how I've grown. Watch what I do with what you teach me." People touching people and giving to other people is how you live a very long life. In the case of a couple of old men, even long enough to surpass their time here on earth. And wherever they are, somewhere in this room, they're sitting and listening to this. And that makes me very happy and very grateful. I thank you very much for listening to me tonight.